Well, at least they fixed his eyebrows. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 8th film in the MCU, Marvel's 2013 sci-fi superhero sequel, Thor: The Dark World. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, ranked lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Thor: The Dark World stars Chris Hemsworth, Natalie Portman, and Tom Hiddleston. It was directed by Alan Taylor. After Jane accidentally discovers an ancient weapon, it's up to Thor to save her and the Nine Realms from an attack by dark elves. Although he's a character who's improved over the years for me, Thor has never been my favorite Avenger. Not even close. I've mentioned it before, but big, mostly invulnerable superheroes just don't do it for me, and can't really keep my interest in the same way that less overpowered heroes can. The first Thor movie has always just been okay for me. Not awful, but not very good either. Needless to say, I wasn't super excited when Thor: The Dark World came out, and didn't even see it until it was out on Blu-ray. Apart from the 3 most recent MCU releases, this movie is actually my least watched MCU film. In fact, in preparing for this review, I watched it for only the 2nd time ever. That probably gives you a pretty good idea of how I initially felt about it. And although I was hopeful that time would change things, I'll admit I wasn't really looking forward to this rewatch. There have been occasions where my revisiting a previously disliked film has led to a new appreciation for it. Only a few months ago, I encountered that exact situation with a rewatch of Jurassic Park 3. So, how did Thor: The Dark World fare on rewatch? Not very well. Plot-wise, Thor: The Dark World picks up where both Thor and the Avengers left off. But tonally, this is a far cry from either. I'll admit that I wasn't a big fan of the mythological Shakespearean melodrama of the first Thor movie. Its cosmic fantasy angle is something that just doesn't appeal to me. And although the sequel leans into that a good deal, once again beginning with a story of inter-realm conflict and heavily focusing on family drama, it does thankfully dial back on it a bit. This time, the sci-fi elements push their way forward, competing with the drama. Inter-realm portals and the thread of the ether are potentially cool ideas, but it all gets bogged down by the lackluster script. Sadly, this Thor sequel is an aggressively dull film. The first Thor was far from being the most engaging film either, but this movie offers very little in the way of interest. There are a few decent action scenes, or parts of action scenes, but it's an otherwise trying, lifeless affair. There's very little character development, even less chemistry between the characters, a very weak villain, and the story itself is plodding and unnecessarily complicated, especially when you realize that the whole point of this film basically boils down to one post-credit scene. This is quite possibly the most filler-esque of the MCU films. I do appreciate the attempts to mostly function as a standalone film within the MCU, but it ends up having very little to offer as a result. That said, this movie isn't a total loss. It does show some improvement over the first Thor when it comes to both the visual effects and the action sequences. Neither are greater than what would eventually come, but they're at least better than what had come before. Thor as a character isn't markedly better, but he does build upon the character development that we saw in the first film. This time, he's the voice of reason, and we really get to see his growth from the arrogant would-be king of the first film. Jane is fine here, with a handful of fun fish-out-of-water moments that were a reversal of what we saw in the first film, but it's not the greatest outing for that character. One character that did really surprise me was Loki. I know a lot of people love him, but he's never been my favorite MCU character, and he was very entertaining here. The relationship and banter between him and Thor was really good, and his presence kept a dull plot mildly interesting due to his unpredictability and deceitfulness. So, after revisiting this film for the first time in quite a while, I can remember why this currently sits at the bottom of my MCU ranking. Even though this is tied with The Incredible Hulk for the shortest runtime of any film in the MCU, it certainly doesn't feel like it. From a technical standpoint, this is a mostly competently made film, but it's so dull. Like any film, I know it's got its fans, but for me, this is one of the true weak points of the MCU. I'm just glad that Thor Ragnarok was able to turn things around and inject some life into the Thor franchise. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro is Loki. Now, I'll admit, as somebody who isn't the biggest Loki fan, I was pleasantly surprised to see how much I enjoyed him when rewatching this film. His moments of humor are among the only ones that actually work in this film, and he just injects some much-needed playfulness into his scenes. The interplay between him and Thor is not only fun, but adds an interesting twist to the relationship that had been previously established in other films. On the con side, the biggest issue is the story. I do appreciate the sci-fi angle that this movie takes, and it had some components that I think could have potentially worked, but it ends up being such a strangely convoluted and unengaging story. The first film had some disconnect between the Earth sequences and the Asgard sequences, but this movie adds to that confusing disconnect by introducing interrealm portals. Add an underwhelming villain and a largely filler plot, and you've got one boring story. Con number 2 is how dull this film is. The story certainly plays into this, but it goes beyond that. With the exception of Loki, the characters feel extraordinarily lifeless this time, and much like the first movie, the pacing is all over the place. There are occasional moments of decent action, but other than those, this is a very bland, by-the-numbers movie that feels like a styleless, collective studio creation rather than a film made by any one director. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Thor: The Dark World or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Thor: The Dark World 2 out of 5 paws. I didn't really like this movie the first time I saw it, but I ended up dropping it another half paw on this rewatch. Loki's got some decent moments here, and the visual effects and action are both improved upon, but otherwise, this is an incredibly dull and unnecessarily convoluted filler story. I would recommend Thor: The Dark World really only to big Thor fans or die-hard MCU fans. We only have a handful of Thor movies, so if you like seeing him, then you'll probably enjoy parts of this one too. Though it should be noted that he's upstaged by Loki nearly every time they're together in this movie. And if you're a really big MCU fan, or just somebody who's a completionist and wants to watch the entire franchise, then you'll probably want to watch this one. It does introduce a few things that come into play towards the end of the Infinity Saga, but it is one of the MCU movies that you could probably get by without watching and still have a decent understanding of what's happening in the multi-film saga arc. If you liked Thor: The Dark World, I would recommend Thor. This is the first Thor movie and serves as his introduction and origin story in Phase 1 of the MCU. It has less of a sci-fi leaning than its sequel, instead heavily focusing on fantasy and mythology, but has a bit more humor and some somewhat decent character arcs. If you want another related MCU film, you should check out The Avengers. This was the first big team-up movie in the MCU, and the events of which are directly referenced many times throughout this movie, especially with regard to Loki. And if you're interested in seeing how this film has some sort of relevancy within the MCU, you might want to watch Avengers Endgame. Not only does that movie heavily focus on the Infinity Stones, which are finally introduced by name in this film, but it also connects directly back to certain events in this movie and explores their impacts on Thor. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Thor: The Dark World? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your least favorite MCU movie? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information on this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.